In today's episode, you'll learn how to get the most out of your podcast show notes. In addition to your eye-catching episode artwork, show notes help set the stage for listeners tuning into your show. Show notes, sometimes called the episode description, tells a listener what they can expect when they press play on an episode of your podcast. In addition to being a great way to communicate information, your show notes can be used to share helpful resources and is prime real estate if you're planning to monetize your show. When done right, show notes can effectively serve multiple purposes and provide a lot of benefits for you and your listeners. Tip number 1. The structure. Let's start by talking about the formatting and structure of your show notes. And I'll use my show notes as an example. I personally approach writing my notes in 3 to 4 sections. The first section, which is the main one, is the description, which consists of a few short sentences telling my listeners about the main topics they can expect to hear us cover in the episode. And if it's an interview episode or I have a special guest on the show, I'll provide some context and background information regarding the guest and their major accolades or bodies of work. The following sections are listed in short bulleted lists. I have on that list timestamps for other segments and topics that might be of interest to the listeners, and a separate list for call to actions. I'll go over this part in more detail later on in this video, but this is where I list and promote links to my podcast merch store, Patreon, or links to items and products mentioned in the episode, like a guest who has a book available for purchase. And the last section is dedicated to helpful links, which is a list of hyperlinks that send listeners to miscellaneous resources related to the podcast, like personal websites, blog posts, social media accounts, and other content where the listeners can follow the show outside of the main podcast. Of course, feel free to restructure and rework the sections I just mentioned to fit the needs of your show. Tip number 2, keep it simple. Keep your show notes short and sweet. Think of this as the opportunity to write an elevator pitch for your episode. Aim to effectively communicate the topic of the episode in a few short sentences and avoid inundating your listeners with a bunch of dense paragraphs. I like to keep in mind my audience, which isn't just my regular listeners who tune in every week, but also any potential listeners who might have come across my show on a whim. Your show notes could be the deciding factor which entices someone new to press play on that episode, and maybe become a lifelong listener. Remember, your show notes are just a preview of what the listener can expect from tuning in. Let your voice and the actual content of the episode do the rest for you. Tip number 3, your calls to action. Show notes are also great for promoting calls to action and other monetization strategies. If your podcast has a merch store or a Patreon, place links to those platforms in your show notes. I encourage my listeners to join my Patreon page in the episode itself by making a reference to the show notes. Like, hey, join our Patreon to get exclusive bonus content. Just check out the link in the show notes for more information. Listeners are more likely to follow through with a call to action like that since it doesn't require them to do a lot of work. The show notes are right there in the podcast app, and the link will take them to exactly where they need to go. If you're part of an affiliate program or you make money from affiliate links, the show notes section is a great place to include those too. Like I said at the top, your show notes are among the first thing most listeners see before they ever press play on your episode. So consider the many types of calls to action that would benefit your podcast and work them into your notes. Tip number 4, work smarter. If you're a podcaster that writes a detailed script or outlines your episodes, consider leveraging those for your notes. More than likely, your outline is composed of the main topics and key points you recorded for the episode anyways, so why not save some time from writing and repurpose as much as you can for your show notes? Of course, it might require a bit of editing to get the outline trimmed to a shorter version for the show notes, but I find that repurposing my outline gives my notes a better sense of consistency and provides the listener with a much more accurate picture of what they can expect to be covered in the podcast. Tip number 5, use timestamps. Timestamps are markers that can be used to indicate when a main topic is started in the show notes. If your podcast covers multiple topics in one episode, or if your podcast is broken down into segments, including a list of timestamps in your show notes could improve the listening experience for your audience. It allows the listener the ability to find the content that's most important to them without having to skip around. I personally mark the main topics and segments of my podcast with timestamps written in parentheses. If you host your podcast on Buzzsprout, there's a dedicated section for timestamps called chapter markers. It's the same concept and even creates a dedicated tab on your Buzzsprout episode page where listeners can tap through and see what's coming up. Now that I've shared with you some of my favorite tips and tricks for getting the most out of your show notes, I want you to consider which of these strategies you can incorporate into your own notes to take them to the next level. And if you want to learn more about chapter markers, this video tells you everything you need to know. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, keep podcasting.